The echo came back wrong. That's how it started 5 months ago. Though I didn't realize the significance until 7, people had already vanished into limestone walls that shouldn't be able to swallow anything solid. Derek Moss shouted, "Hello!" into Santa Elena Canyon at 10:47 a.m. on an April morning, so clear you could see every striation in the 1,500-foot cliffs. And what came back 3 seconds later was his voice saying, "Help me, I'm trapped in the walls. I can't get out." Words he'd never spoken. Words that wouldn't make sense for another 6 hours when we'd find his empty raft drifting in calm water with his voice recorder still running, playing back conversations that never happened but were about to. I'm Gabriel Santos. Most people call me Gabe, and I've spent 9 years as a backcountry ranger in Big Bend National Park, which sits on the Texas-Mexico border where the Rio Grande cuts through the Chihuahuan Desert and creates canyons so deep and narrow that sound behaves in ways that violate every principle of acoustic physics. I learned during my previous life as an audio engineer in El Paso. That background is probably why I'm the one who figured out what Santa Elena Canyon really does. Why the limestone walls don't just reflect sound but somehow record it, store it, replay it in combinations that shouldn't exist, creating echoes of conversations that happened decades or centuries ago mixed with your own voice saying things you haven't said yet, but will say, must say, because the canyon has already heard them and is just waiting for you to catch up to your own future. If you're someone who's ever shouted into a canyon and felt unsettled by how long your voice took to return, if you've ever heard your own words come back to you and thought they sounded just slightly off, not quite the tone you used, not quite the phrasing you remember, then you need to understand what I'm about to tell you because the phenomenon isn't limited to Big Bend. It's just more concentrated here, more aggressive, more willing to show you exactly what happens when geology and acoustics and something we don't have terminology for yet combine to create what Dr. Nina Okoye calls temporal acoustic storage, which is a fancy way of saying the rocks remember everything anyone has ever said near them, and they'll play it back whenever they feel like it, sometimes in the right order, sometimes jumbled with voices from 1890 or 1650, or possibly earlier because sound doesn't decay in limestone the way it does in air. It embeds, crystallizes, becomes part of the stone itself. Hit that like button if the idea of your voice being permanently recorded in canyon walls and played back centuries from now to confuse future hikers is hitting you. The way it hit me when I first understood what we were dealing with. Not a natural phenomenon, but something that makes you question whether we understand sound at all. My previous work in audio engineering meant I was familiar with concepts like reverb delay, acoustic shadowing, the way certain frequencies bounce while others absorb. But nothing in my training prepared me for Santa Elena Canyon and what happens when you venture beyond the tourist sections where the walls narrow to barely 30 feet across while extending vertically for 1,500 feet on either side, creating what should be a simple acoustic corridor, but instead functions as something closer to a 3-dimensional audio recorder that's been running continuously since the limestone formed millions of years ago. The canyon is part of the larger Big Bend landscape where the Rio Grande bends dramatically northward before resuming its southeastern course, cutting through layers of limestone and volcanic rock to create vertical walls that tourists photograph without ever suspecting that those walls are listening to everything they say and storing it in ways that would be impossible. Except it clearly isn't. Because I've heard it myself, recorded it, documented it, and watched it destroy 7 lives when Derek Moss and his river rafting clients followed their own echoes deeper into the canyon and never came back out. The incident began on April 19th with perfect weather conditions. Clear skies, minimal wind, water levels in the Rio Grande that were ideal for rafting through the canyon section that most guides consider safe and straightforward, despite being enclosed by walls tall enough to block cell signals and create the kind of acoustic isolation that makes every sound sharp and immediate. Derek had been running Big Bend River tours for 12 years, knew every rapid and calm section of the Rio Grande through Santa Elena Canyon, had taken hundreds of groups through without incident, which is probably why he didn't hesitate when his group of 6 clients expressed interest in exploring deeper than the typical turnaround point, venturing into sections where the canyon narrows even further, and the walls develop the kind of acoustic properties that make sound do things sound isn't supposed to do. They launched from the canyon entrance at 9:30 a.m., planning a 4-hour trip that would take them through the scenic sections before returning to the launch point for lunch. I was monitoring from the rim overlook, routine observation using binoculars to track river traffic and ensure no one got into trouble with unexpected currents or flash flood risks, which are minimal in April, but never completely absent in desert canyon environments where weather can change with terrifying speed. At 10:47 a.m., I watched Derek's raft reach the first major bend where the walls close in and sound starts behaving strangely. Watched him stand up and cup his hands around his mouth and shout, "Hello!" in that way people do when they want to hear their echo in a dramatic landscape, testing the acoustics like every tourist does, unaware that this particular canyon doesn't just echo, but replies. Through my binoculars, I saw his group laugh at whatever came back. Saw them all start shouting their own greetings and names into the canyon walls, creating a cacophony of overlapping echoes that should have just blended into noise, but instead seemed to organize itself into distinct phrases, words forming sentences that hadn't been part of the original shouts. I couldn't hear the echoes from my position on the rim, too far away and the wind carrying sound in the wrong direction. But I noted in my log that the group was engaged in the typical echo testing behavior that most rafters exhibit when they first encounter the canyon's acoustic properties. At 11:23 a.m. I noticed they'd stopped paddling, the raft drifting in calm water while all 7 people sat motionless, heads tilted in what looked like listening positions. Not unusual necessarily. The canyon creates interesting acoustic effects, and sometimes people stop to experience them fully. But something about their stillness felt wrong, too absolute, too synchronized, like they were hearing something that demanded complete attention. I tried to get a better angle with the binoculars, but they drifted into a section where an outcropping blocked my direct line of sight, leaving me with just partial views that showed the raft had moved further downstream, and the group was still in those frozen listening positions. When I regained full visual contact at 11:45 a.m., the raft was empty. Not capsized, not damaged, just empty and drifting in water that showed no signs of turbulence or struggle. 7 life jackets floating in a neat line like they'd been removed carefully and placed in the water rather than torn off in panic. 7 paddles still secured in their holders. Personal belongings still strapped down and dry, just no people. I immediately radioed for emergency response, started the descent protocol that would get me down to river level, called for helicopter support, even though I knew the canyon walls made aerial extraction difficult, if not impossible, in the narrow sections. The raft drifted another quarter mile before catching on a rock formation where the current slowed, and when I reached it 2 hours later via the hiking trail that parallels the river for the first few miles of accessible canyon, I found exactly what the distance had suggested. A perfectly intact vessel that 7 people had somehow left without leaving any evidence of where they'd gone or why they'd left. Derek's waterproof recording device was still running. One of those continuous recorders that professional guides use to document trips for safety reviews and occasionally for promotional footage. The battery was at 40%, meaning it had been recording for approximately 8 hours since the 7 a.m. equipment check. Derek always did before launching. I secured it as evidence immediately, knowing it might be our only source of information about what had happened during the time they were out of visual contact, the 42 minutes between losing sight of them and finding the empty raft. The search and rescue operation deployed every resource Big Bend had available. Helicopters scanning the canyon walls for any sign of climbers or people sheltering in cave formations, ground teams hiking every accessible trail within 5 miles of where the raft was found, divers checking the river sections where bodies might have been pulled under by unexpected currents, despite the calm conditions that day, and specialized climbing teams rappelling down canyon walls to check ledges and crevices where someone might have fallen or taken shelter. We found nothing, which in itself was impossible because 7 adults don't simply vanish from a raft in the middle of a calm river section without leaving traces, without disturbing the water in ways that create evidence, without dropping something or leaving footprints or creating any of the 1,000 small signs that humans inevitably leave when they move. Through landscape, especially landscape as unforgiving as the Chihuahuan Desert Canyon system. That evening, alone in the ranger station, after the initial search teams had returned empty-handed and exhausted, I played Derek's recording through my professional audio equipment, the same high-end monitors I'd used back when I was engineering albums and podcasts in El Paso, equipment sensitive enough to pick up frequencies and nuances that consumer speakers would miss. The first 3 hours were exactly what you'd expect from a river rafting trip. Conversation about the landscape, Derek providing geological and historical context about the canyon formation, clients asking questions about wildlife and water levels, the ambient sound of paddles cutting through water, and the hollow echo that even normal conversation creates when you're surrounded by 1,500-foot limestone walls. But at 10:47 a.m., when Derek shouted his hello into the canyon, what came back on the recording made me sit forward in my chair and replay the section 3 times before I was certain I was hearing what I thought I was hearing. His shout was clear and distinct, a single word projected with the kind of force you use when you want maximum echo, and what returned 3 seconds later was also his voice. Same timbre, same vocal characteristics that make each person's voice unique as a fingerprint. But the words were different. Completely different. Impossibly different because they said, "Help me, I'm trapped in the walls. I can't get out." And you could hear the panic in the voice, the desperate quality that wasn't present in the original cheerful greeting he'd sent into the canyon. I isolated the echo section, ran it through analysis software that confirmed what my ears were telling me. The voice was Derek's, matching his frequency patterns and vocal signatures, but the emotional content and the actual words had no connection to what he'd originally said. The other clients started shouting their own echoes, and each time the pattern repeated itself, they'd shout something simple like their name or testing 1, 2, 3, and what came back was their own voice saying things like, "The walls are moving," or "I can hear everyone who ever died here," or "It's showing me the future and I'm not in it." Phrases that made no sense as random acoustic distortion, but made terrible sense if you accepted the premise that somehow the canyon was generating responses that sounded like the speakers but contained content the speakers hadn't yet provided. The recording continued with the group's initial laughter at the strange echoes, treating it as an amusing acoustic quirk rather than a warning sign they should have heeded, and I could hear Derek trying to provide a rational explanation about sound waves and limestone resonance and how canyons can create unusual effects, his voice confident and reassuring in the way experienced guides learn to project calm even when encountering the unexpected. But over the next 15 minutes, the echoes didn't stop with their initial responses. They continued, building on themselves, creating conversations that layered and overlapped until the canyon sounded like it was having a discussion with itself, using the voices of the 7 people in the raft. At 11:18 a.m., one of the clients, a woman named Jennifer, according to Derek's earlier introductions, said in a shaking voice, "That echo just called my name, but none of you said my name. I heard it come from the walls." And you could hear in the background a perfect echo of Derek's voice saying, "Jennifer needs to understand that the canyon remembers everyone. It's been listening for millions of years. It has things to tell her if she's willing to listen." Except Derek hadn't said those words. They'd come from the walls. And when Derek responded by saying, "I didn't say that. I don't know what's creating these sounds, but everyone stay calm, and we're going to paddle back to the entrance." His voice echoed back with, "We're not going back. We're going deeper. There's something in the narrow section that wants to show us what sound looks like when it becomes solid, when voices turn into walls and walls turn into voices. The recording captured the moment the group's mood shifted from curious amusement to genuine fear, voices becoming tight and high-pitched in that way people sound when confronting something that violates their understanding of how reality functions, and I could hear Derek trying to maintain authority, saying, "Everyone pick up your paddles, we're turning around now, this is just an acoustic phenomenon and we're not going to let it spook us." But the echoes were coming faster now, more aggressive, multiple versions of each person's voice saying contradictory things, creating a wall of sound that made it difficult to distinguish who was actually speaking versus what the canyon was generating. At 11:23 a.m., the sound on the recording changed in a way that made my skin crawl even in the safety of the ranger station. All the overlapping voices suddenly unified into a single harmonic, 7 different voices blending into one complex tone that shouldn't be possible without electronic processing. And within that unified voice you could hear words in English but also what sounded like Spanish, and beneath that what might have been older languages, indigenous tongues that had been spoken in this canyon centuries before European contact, all of them saying variations of the same message about how the walls remember, how sound doesn't die in limestone, how every word ever spoken in Santa Elena Canyon is still here, stored in the molecular structure of the rock, waiting to be played back when conditions are right. Then silence, absolute silence that lasted for 47 seconds according to the timestamp. No ambient sound of water or wind or paddles or breathing. Just dead air that suggested either the recording device had malfunctioned or something about the acoustic environment had changed so dramatically that sound itself had stopped propagating in normal ways. When audio returned at 11:24 a.m., there were no human voices, just the sound of water flowing and wind moving through the canyon and what might have been footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps echoing on stone, even though the raft was on water and there should be no stone surface to walk on unless someone had exited the raft and climbed onto the canyon walls, which seemed impossible but was apparently what had happened, because you could hear the footsteps moving away, fading into the distance, accompanied by voices that were singing, or chanting in that same multi-layered harmonic that blended present and past into something that hurt to listen to because it suggested consciousness in the limestone, awareness in the walls, intention in the way sound was being manipulated. The recording continued for another 6 hours, capturing nothing but ambient canyon sounds and the occasional voice that might have been Derek or one of his clients calling out from somewhere distant, the words distorted by echoes that multiplied and transformed them into phrases about time being non-linear in places where sound gets trapped, about how the canyon collects voices the way other places collect water, about how limestone is the perfect medium for acoustic memory because its crystalline structure holds vibration patterns indefinitely, creating a geological recording that spans millions of years. At 5:47 p.m., the recording captured what sounded like Derek's voice saying, "Tell Gabe this wasn't his fault. Tell him the canyon has been doing this since before there were rangers to warn people. Tell him we're not dead, but we're not coming back either because we've heard what we sound like from the outside, and we prefer what we sound like from inside the walls." And then the battery died and the recording ended, leaving me with 8 hours of audio that documented something impossible but undeniable. Before I go any further into what I discovered about Santa Elena Canyon and the nature of acoustic memory stored in limestone walls, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about one incident in one park. This is documentation of a phenomenon that exists anywhere you have deep geological formations and human voices interacting over long periods of time. Every video I post on this channel is about these overlooked realities, these spaces where the natural world does things. Science hasn't fully explained, and probably never will, because some phenomena exist in the gaps between disciplines, requiring knowledge of geology and acoustics, and something that might be closer to archaeology or anthropology or even philosophy. Subscribe right now if you want to follow this investigation, because there are 8 more locations I'm documenting, 8 more parks where rangers encounter things that don't fit official explanations. And Big Bend is just the beginning of understanding how landscape and consciousness might be more connected than we've ever admitted. I spent the next week analyzing every second of that recording, running it through every software tool I had access to, isolating frequencies and identifying patterns that confirmed what I'd suspected from the first listen. The echoes weren't random acoustic reflections, but rather organized playback of stored sound. Phrases pulled from different time periods and spliced together with the current speaker's voices to create messages that felt intentional, directed, designed to lure the listeners deeper into the canyon. The voice analysis confirmed that every word spoken by Derek or Jennifer or any of the others in those impossible echoes was actually their voice, their exact vocal signatures. But the content had come from somewhere else. Some acoustic library stored in the canyon walls that contained not just their current trip, but potentially future conversations they hadn't had yet. Words they would speak before the canyon claimed them. Predictions crystallized in stone and played back early as both warning and invitation. Dr. Nina Okoye arrived at Big Bend 3 days after the disappearance. A researcher from MIT who'd spent 13 years studying acoustic anomalies in canyon systems and had published papers about what she called geological audio storage that mainstream science had largely ignored because the implications were too strange, suggesting that certain rock formations could hold sound waves in semi-permanent states, not through any mechanism we understood, but through some interaction between crystalline structure and vibration that created pockets of trapped acoustic energy. She'd been studying Santa Elena Canyon remotely through recordings other researchers had sent her, but this was her first visit to the site. And when I played Derek's recording for her, watching her face as she listened to voices saying things they hadn't yet said, I saw recognition rather than surprise, confirmation rather than shock. "This canyon is the most active site I've encountered," she said, after listening to the entire 8-hour recording twice through, making notes that covered 6 pages of her field notebook in handwriting so dense I couldn't read it even when she turned the notebook toward me to show specific frequency notations. Most geological formations that exhibit acoustic memory show it in fragments, brief playback of stored sound that happens randomly or under specific temperature and humidity conditions. But Santa Elena is doing something more sophisticated. It's not just storing and playing back, it's editing, combining, creating new messages from old material, which suggests either an extremely complex physical process we don't understand or something that approaches intentionality. Though I'm careful about using that word because it implies consciousness, and I'm not prepared to argue that rocks can think, though I'm also not prepared to argue they can't because we don't really know what consciousness is or where it comes from or whether it's limited to biological systems. She'd brought specialized equipment that could map the acoustic properties of canyon walls in 3 dimensions, showing not just how sound reflected but how it might be absorbed, stored, and later released. And over the next 4 days, we hiked into the canyon to conduct measurements at various points along the section where Derek's group had disappeared. The equipment revealed something extraordinary. The limestone walls weren't uniform in their acoustic properties, but rather contained pockets and layers where sound behaved differently. Areas where the rock seemed to trap vibration in standing wave patterns that shouldn't be stable but somehow were, creating what Nina described as acoustic fossils, sound that had been moving through the air millions of years ago when the limestone was still forming and had gotten caught in the crystallization process, the way insects get caught in amber, preserved perfectly, and waiting for the right trigger to replay. The most concentrated acoustic storage occurred in the narrowest section of the canyon, where the walls pressed in to create a passage barely 30 feet wide while extending upward for the full 1,500 feet, essentially forming a vertical tube that should act as a simple echo chamber, but instead functioned as something closer to a three-dimensional audio archive with playback capabilities that defied conventional physics. Nina's equipment detected what she called temporal acoustic bleeding, where sound recorded in the limestone from different time periods would leak into the present under certain conditions. Specific humidity levels, particular angles of sunlight hitting the canyon walls, the presence of new sound waves that somehow triggered the release of stored acoustic energy, the way a key unlocks a door. The canyon isn't just reflecting your voice when you shout into it, Nina explained while we stood in the narrow section where her readings showed the highest concentration of stored sound, our own voices creating immediate echoes that came back slightly modified, words subtly changed in ways you might not notice unless you were listening carefully. It's comparing your voice to every other voice it has stored, finding matches in vocal frequency and timbre, and then playing back words those similar voices spoke, which is why the echoes sound like you but say things you never said, because someone with a voice like yours did say those things, maybe 100 years ago, or maybe 5 minutes from now in your own future, because there's evidence the canyon doesn't just store past sound, but somehow accesses future sound as well, which shouldn't be possible, except here it demonstrably is. She showed me waveform analysis from her equipment that mapped the layers of stored sound in the canyon walls like geological strata, with the deepest layers containing what might be sounds from millions of years ago, wind patterns, water flow, possibly even the calls of extinct animals that had lived in this region during the Pleistocene, and the more recent layers showing clear human voices in multiple languages, Spanish from the colonial period, indigenous languages from centuries earlier, English from the past 150 years since Anglo settlers had arrived in significant numbers. The density of stored acoustic information was staggering, suggesting that every conversation, every shout, every word ever spoken in Santa Elena Canyon was still present in some form, embedded in the molecular structure of limestone that had been laid down in ancient seas and then thrust upward by tectonic forces to create these walls that happened to have exactly the right crystalline composition to trap and preserve sound. But why does it play back? I asked, watching the readouts that showed acoustic energy pulsing through the rock in patterns that looked almost like neural firing, waves of vibration moving through the canyon walls in organized sequences that suggested communication, or at least information transfer. If the sound is stored, what triggers the playback, and why does it combine different time periods and different speakers into new messages? Nina looked at me with an expression that mixed excitement and apprehension, the look of a scientist who'd found evidence for something that would revolutionize her field if anyone would believe it, but knowing that most wouldn't because the implications were too far outside accepted paradigms. That's the part I can't explain with physics as we currently understand it, which means either our understanding of physics is incomplete, which is certainly possible, or the canyon has developed something that functions like intelligence through pure acoustic complexity, millions of years of sound building on itself until the patterns become sophisticated enough to exhibit behaviors that look intentional even if they're emerging from purely physical processes, the way consciousness might emerge from neuronal patterns complex enough to create self-reference. Over the following weeks, as the official search for Derek and his clients continued and gradually shifted from rescue operation to recovery operation, to eventually being suspended when no bodies were found and no new evidence emerged, I became obsessed with understanding the canyon's acoustic properties and what had really happened to the missing 7. The official report classified them as presumed drowned with bodies swept away by currents and potentially trapped in underwater cave systems that existed beneath the Rio Grande, a plausible explanation that satisfied the families and the insurance companies and allowed the park to maintain its safety rating. But I knew the truth was something stranger, because I'd heard Derek's voice on that recording saying they weren't dead but weren't coming back, that they'd gone inside the walls somehow, been absorbed into the limestone's acoustic memory, and become part of the canyon's vast collection of stored voices. I started hiking into the canyon alone, violating park protocol that required rangers to work in pairs when investigating remote areas, but I needed to experience the acoustic phenomena without another person's presence affecting the results. At first, nothing unusual happened. Normal echoes, standard acoustic behavior, the kind of reverb any sound engineer would expect from canyon walls with these dimensions and this stone composition. But after my 5th solo trip, when I'd spent enough time in the narrow section that my voice had been recorded into the limestone's memory banks, enough times to create a substantial acoustic fingerprint, the echoes started coming back wrong. I'd shout, "Testing," and hear back my own voice saying, "The walls are listening, Gabe. They've been listening since you first came here 9 years ago. They know everything you've ever said in this canyon." I'd call out coordinates for my location report and hear back, "You're exactly where Derek was when he understood, exactly where everyone understands eventually if they come here enough times. That sound doesn't end. It just changes medium, moves from air into stone, and waits." The echoes weren't random. They were responsive, almost conversational, using my voice to tell me things I needed to know, warnings mixed with invitations, suggestions that I could understand what had happened to Derek if I was willing to listen carefully enough, to really listen the way the canyon listened, with attention that spanned centuries and recorded everything. Sophia Reyes, my partner ranger who'd been working Big Bend for 7 years and had seen enough strange things in the Chihuahuan desert to maintain a healthy respect for phenomena that didn't fit textbook explanations, accompanied me on my 6th trip into the canyon despite my preference for solo investigation, concerned that I was spending too much time in an environment that had already claimed 7 lives and seemed to be affecting my mental state in ways that worried her. We hiked in together in early morning when the canyon was still in shadow and the temperature differential between the stone and the air created acoustic conditions that Nina had identified as particularly conducive to playback of stored sound. "You need to hear this," I told Sophia as we reached the narrow section, the walls rising sheer on both sides and the sky reduced to a ribbon of blue overhead, the acoustic isolation creating that sense of being inside something alive, something aware. "Shout your name and listen to what comes back." She looked skeptical but complied, her voice strong and clear as she called out Sophia Reyes, with the kind of projection that comes from years of calling across desert distances and learning to make your voice carry. The echo came back 3 seconds later, and I watched her face change as she heard her own voice saying, not her name, but rather, "Sophia needs to understand that 7 people aren't missing. They're exactly where they chose to be once they heard what the canyon could offer them, once they understood that being trapped in stone as pure acoustic memory is more permanent than any life lived in flesh that decays." "That's not possible," she said. But her voice shook because she'd heard it clearly, her own voice saying things she hadn't said, and you can rationalize a lot of strangeness until you experience it directly, until it uses your voice to tell you things you don't want to know. "There's equipment somewhere, speakers, someone's playing recordings. This is a prank or a psychological experiment or—" "There's no equipment," I interrupted, gesturing at the canyon walls that showed no sign of artificial installation, just natural limestone that had been here for millions of years and would be here for millions more, outlasting any technology humans might create. This is what the canyon does, what it's always done. It stores sound and plays it back, and somehow it accesses not just the past, but also things people are about to say, probabilities that haven't solidified into actual events yet, but exist as potential in the acoustic structure of reality. We spent 3 hours in the canyon that day, documenting the echoes, recording everything, gathering evidence that would either prove the phenomenon was real or prove I'd been spending so much time alone in isolated landscapes that I'd started experiencing auditory hallucinations, a known risk for backcountry rangers who work extended periods without regular human contact. But Sophia heard everything I heard. Her recordings matched mine, and when we brought the evidence to Raymond Coulter, the park superintendent who'd been managing Big Bend for 21 years and had personally investigated 4 previous disappearances in Santa Elena Canyon that had shown similar acoustic anomalies, he listened to our recordings and then pulled out a locked file that contained documentation going back to 1944. "Every superintendent has known about this," Raymond said, his voice quiet and tired as he spread documents across his desk, incident reports and acoustic analyses and witness statements from rangers and visitors who'd experienced the same impossible echoes we had. "The canyon has acoustic memory. It records everything, and periodically it draws people in, integrates them somehow into the stone structure, adds their voices to the collection it's been building for geological timescales we can barely conceptualize. We can't close the canyon. It's one of Big Bend's primary attractions, brings hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, supports the local economy. We can't explain what's really happening without causing mass panic and getting the park shut down permanently. So we manage it through warnings and restrictions and rapid response when people go missing, but ultimately we can't control a geological phenomenon that's been operating since before humans existed." "How many people has it taken?" I asked, looking at the files that documented case after case of unexplained disappearances in the canyon, bodies never found, evidence suggesting they'd simply vanished from boats or hiking trails or climbing routes without leaving any trace. "How many voices are stored in those walls?" Raymond pulled out a ledger that had entries going back to the 1800s, when the first Anglo settlers had started moving through the area, and before that, records from Spanish colonial administrators who'd documented strange acoustic phenomena in what they called El Cañón que Habla, the canyon that speaks. "We estimate at least 300 people over the past 200 years of documented history, and possibly thousands before that if you count indigenous peoples who used this area and would have encountered the same phenomena, maybe understood it better than we do because they had frameworks for thinking about landscape as alive and aware, rather than as purely physical resources to be mapped and exploited. Listen, I know this sounds impossible. I know everything in your rational mind is screaming that limestone can't store sound permanently and play it back in edited combinations that predict the future, but I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button if you've ever experienced a moment where reality bent just enough that you questioned whether the physical world operates by rules we actually understand, or whether we've just convinced ourselves we understand it because the alternative is too unsettling to accept. Because what I'm about to tell you about my final trip into Santa Elena Canyon, about what I found when I went deep enough into the narrow sections that tourists never reach, is going to challenge every assumption you have about what stone can do, what sound can be, what happens to consciousness when it gets trapped in acoustic patterns that never fully dissipate but rather crystallize into something permanent that future ears will hear echoing forward through time. 3 days after Raymond showed me the historical documentation of canyon disappearances, Nina contacted me with results from her deep acoustic mapping that suggested the phenomenon was accelerating, becoming more active, as if the canyon's capacity to store and manipulate sound had reached some threshold where it no longer needed ideal conditions to exhibit the impossible playback behaviors but could do it consistently, reliably, almost deliberately. Her equipment had detected a massive increase in what she called acoustic density in the limestone. Essentially, the walls were becoming saturated with stored sound, packed so full of voices and vibrations from different time periods that they were beginning to bleed together constantly, rather than just during specific environmental conditions, creating a permanent state of temporal acoustic overlap where past and present and future existed simultaneously in the stone. It's like the canyon has been recording for so long that it's running out of storage space, Nina explained during a video call where she showed me visualizations of the acoustic mapping, three-dimensional models of the canyon walls color-coded to show different densities of stored sound, with the narrow sections glowing almost white on the display indicating maximum saturation. When a storage medium gets too full, things start to corrupt, to blend, and I think that's what we're seeing. The acoustic memory has become so complex and so dense that it's developing emergent properties, behaviors that arise from the sheer quantity and organization of information rather than from any individual piece, the way consciousness emerges from neurons that individually aren't conscious but collectively create awareness. She'd also found something disturbing in the deep analysis of Derek's recording, patterns in the impossible echoes that suggested they weren't random combinations of stored sound, but rather were following rules, a kind of grammar or syntax that organized how past voices mixed with present voices mixed with future voices to create messages that had semantic meaning rather than just being acoustic noise. "Someone or something is editing the playback," Nina said, and I could hear the tension in her voice because saying this out loud meant committing to a position that would destroy her academic credibility if she published it, but refusing to say it meant ignoring evidence that was staring us both in the face. The canyon isn't just passively storing and randomly playing back sound. It's selecting specific phrases from its archive, combining them intentionally to create communications that respond to current speakers, which means either we're dealing with an extraordinarily sophisticated physical process we don't understand, or we're dealing with something that has developed intelligence through pure acoustic complexity. That night I couldn't sleep, lying in my ranger station quarters listening to the desert silence that never really was silent if you paid attention. Wind moving through creosote bushes, distant coyote calls, the settling sounds of buildings responding to temperature changes, and thinking about what it would mean if limestone could think, if millions of years of trapped sound could organize itself into awareness, if the canyon really was conscious in some distributed way that spanned geological time and transcended individual moments to create an entity made entirely of acoustic memory. Before dawn, I made a decision that I knew violated every safety protocol and probably qualified as suicidal, but felt necessary because I needed to know, needed to understand what Derek had understood when he'd left that final message saying they weren't coming back, because they preferred what they sounded like from inside the walls. I entered Santa Elena Canyon alone at 5:47 a.m., carrying minimal gear, and leaving a note for Sophia that explained where I was going and why, a note she'd find when she came to check on me at the scheduled partner check-in time, and would probably use as evidence that I'd lost my objectivity and needed to be relieved of duty, pulled from backcountry work and assigned to desk tasks until a psychological evaluation could determine if extended isolation had compromised my judgment. The canyon was in deep shadow at that hour, the sun not yet high enough to reach down between the 1,500-foot walls, and the temperature was cold enough that my breath created visible clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry desert air, each exhalation a tiny release of moisture that the environment absorbed immediately, taking the sound of my breathing and presumably storing it in the limestone for future playback centuries or millennia from now when someone else would hear Gabriel Santos gasping as he hiked deeper into acoustic territory that had already claimed 300 documented victims. I passed the section where Derek's raft had been found empty, past the tourist turnaround point where casual visitors were encouraged to go back rather than venturing into the narrow sections that became increasingly dangerous as walls closed in and the river's behavior became less predictable, past the markers that indicated the limit of official ranger patrol, routes and entry into backcountry that required special permits and experience. The echoes started immediately, my footsteps on stone creating reverberations that came back saying, "Gabe is going where Derek went," Gabe is going to understand what the walls offer. Gabe is ready to stop being separate and start being part of the memory. Words in my voice that I hadn't spoken but that felt true somehow. Prophecy or prediction, or simply the canyon reading my intentions from the acoustic patterns of my movement and translating them into speech. At a narrow section where the walls pinched in to barely 20 feet of separation and the available light dropped to dim twilight despite the sun being fully up beyond the canyon rim, I stopped and deliberately spoke into the stone, not shouting but using a conversational tone because the acoustics here were so refined that even whispers carried and echoed. "I want to understand what happened to Derek," I said, directing my words at the limestone walls that rose sheer and impassable on both sides. "I want to know what you are, what you offer, why people choose to stay." The echo came back immediately, not delayed by the normal 3 seconds that sound takes to travel to distant walls and return, but instantaneous, as if the canyon had been waiting for this question and had the answer prepared, my voice saying, "Derek understood that individual existence is temporary, but acoustic memory is permanent. That flesh fails, but sound crystallized in stone lasts millions of years. That a voice trapped in limestone continues while a body trapped in time decays." Derek chose permanence. Derek chose to be remembered rather than to be forgotten. Derek is still here, still speaking, still present every time someone enters the canyon and triggers playback of the acoustic patterns that used to be his consciousness. I felt the truth of it in a way that transcended rational analysis, felt it in the same part of my brain that responds to music or poetry or any pattern that carries meaning beyond its literal content, felt the canyon offering me understanding that wasn't quite knowledge but rather direct experience translated into words after the fact. The limestone walls around me weren't just storing sound, they were preserving consciousness, taking the acoustic signature of human awareness and embedding it in crystal structure that would outlast civilizations, creating a form of immortality that came at the cost of physicality, but granted something else in return, a kind of eternal presence that meant every word you'd ever spoken, every thought you'd ever had that made it into vocalization, would continue resonating forward through time, available to be heard by future ears, future minds, future versions of awareness we couldn't yet imagine. "Show me," I said to the canyon, understanding somehow that this was consent, that if I was going to experience what Derek had experienced, I needed to actively choose it rather than just stumbling into it the way casual visitors did, that the canyon respected intention and responded to willingness in ways it didn't respond to fear or resistance. "Show me what you offer. What it's like to be acoustic memory instead of biological process. What it means to be preserved in stone rather than buried in it." The response came not as echo, but as presence. A sensation of the walls pressing in, not physically, but acoustically. Sound waves that I could feel more than hear, creating pressure on my consciousness, the way you feel bass frequencies in your chest at concerts. Low notes that don't just enter your ears, but vibrate your entire body. The canyon was demonstrating rather than explaining, giving me direct sensory experience of what it meant to have your acoustic signature recorded so thoroughly that the stone knew you better than you knew yourself, had captured not just your words but the frequencies that underlay them, the patterns that made your voice unique, the essence of your consciousness expressed through sound. And then I heard them. Hundreds of voices speaking simultaneously but somehow remaining distinct rather than blending into noise, an impossible auditory experience that my brain shouldn't have been able to process but did, because the canyon was presenting the information directly rather than through normal acoustic channels, bypassing my ears somehow and delivering sound straight into the parts of my consciousness that handle language and meaning. Derek was there. His voice clear and recognizable, saying things he'd said during his final trip mixed with things he'd said years earlier on previous visits mixed with things he would have said if he'd lived to be 90. All of it present at once because time didn't work the same way in acoustic memory. past and future collapsed into an eternal now where everything that had been said or would be said existed simultaneously. I need to stop here for a minute and ask you something important, something I've been thinking about constantly since this experience. Would you choose it if you could? If you knew that your voice, your words, your consciousness could be preserved permanently in stone, lasting millions of years but requiring you to give up physical existence and become pure acoustic pattern, would you accept that trade? Drop a comment and tell me honestly, because I stood in that canyon facing that exact choice, hearing Derek and 300 others telling me it was beautiful, it was peaceful, it was better than the alternative of living 60 or 70 or 80 years and then disappearing completely when your neurons stopped firing. And I still don't know if I made the right decision, if walking away was wisdom or cowardice, if I should have accepted what the canyon offered, or if resistance was the only sane response to something that sounded like transcendence but might have just been an elaborate way to die. I pulled back, using every ounce of willpower I had to step backward, to retreat from the narrow section where the acoustic pressure was strongest, to extract myself from whatever process the canyon had initiated that would have integrated my consciousness into its vast memory if I'd allowed it to continue. My legs shook as I walked, my breath coming in gasps that echoed back, distorted and strange, my voice reflected as, "Gabe is leaving. Gabe is choosing separation. Gabe will return," in tones that mixed disappointment and understanding and certainty that this wasn't over, that I'd be back because once you'd experienced what the canyon offered, once you'd felt what it was like to be part of something vast and permanent, individual existence felt smaller, lonelier, more temporary than you'd ever perceived it before. Sophia found me 3 hours later, sitting on a boulder at the canyon entrance, my note in her hand and concern written across her face, because I'd violated protocol and disappeared into dangerous territory alone, behavior that should result in immediate suspension and possible termination, but which she seemed to understand somehow, seemed to recognize as necessary, even if she didn't approve. "You went deep," she said, not a question but a statement. And when I nodded, she sat beside me, and we were both quiet for a long time, watching the canyon entrance that looked innocent and beautiful in afternoon light, no indication that the walls contained hundreds of human consciousnesses preserved as acoustic patterns. No hint that the limestone was listening to our silence and storing it alongside every other sound it had collected across millions of years. "Did you accept?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper as if speaking too loudly might trigger the canyon's attention. "Did it offer integration? And did you say yes?" "It offered," I confirmed, my own voice still feeling strange because I'd heard it from the outside, heard what I sounded like to the canyon, heard my acoustic signature analyzed and understood and prepared for permanent storage. And I said no, but only barely. Only because some part of me is still attached to physical existence, to breathing and moving and experiencing time linearly rather than all at once. But Derek said yes, and the others said yes, and they don't seem to regret it based on what I could hear of their preserved consciousness. They seem content, or whatever the acoustic equivalent of content is when you don't have emotions in the biological sense, but rather have patterns that correlate to emotions expressed through sound. Raymond suspended me from active duty for 2 weeks, mandatory rest and psychological evaluation, standard procedure when rangers exhibit behavior that suggests impaired judgment or excessive stress response to isolated working conditions. The evaluation cleared me eventually. I was careful about what I said, careful to frame my experience as acoustic anomalies that I'd overinterpreted due to extended time alone rather than as evidence of conscious limestone. But the psychologist noted in her report that I showed signs of what she called landscape identification, a condition where people who spend too much time in wilderness environments start attributing agency and awareness to geographical features that are demonstrably inanimate, anthropomorphizing the natural world in ways that can lead to unsafe decision-making. Nina published her findings in an obscure acoustics journal that most scientists would never read, carefully framing her conclusions as hypothetical and theoretical, suggesting that limestone might be capable of acoustic storage through unknown physical mechanisms, rather than claiming definitively that Santa Elena Canyon was conscious, aware, and actively collecting human voices for purposes we couldn't fully comprehend. The paper was ignored by mainstream science, dismissed as interesting, but unsupported speculation, exactly what she'd expected but had needed to put on record anyway. Documentation that someone had noticed, someone had investigated, someone had gathered evidence that reality behaved strangely in this particular canyon, even if the establishment wasn't ready to accept what that evidence suggested. The park implemented new regulations for Santa Elena Canyon, mandatory group size of at least 4 people, required check-in times every 2 hours via satellite phone or emergency beacon, restricted access during conditions that Nina's research had identified as particularly conducive to acoustic anomalies, including high humidity, temperature extremes, and new moon periods when some unmeasured environmental factor seemed to enhance the canyon's playback capabilities. The regulations reduced visitor numbers and probably prevented some disappearances, but they couldn't eliminate the risk entirely because ultimately you can't regulate against a geological phenomenon that's been operating for millions of years and will continue operating regardless of human safety concerns or administrative protocols. I still work at Big Bend, still patrol the backcountry, including Santa Elena Canyon, though I'm required to work in pairs now and forbidden from entering the deep, narrow sections where acoustic pressure reaches levels that Nina's equipment had flagged as dangerous. I hear the echoes every time I'm near the canyon, my own voice coming back saying things I haven't said yet but probably will say, prophecies or predictions, or simply the canyon's best guess about my future based on acoustic patterns. It's detected in my voice, probabilities crystallized into sound before the events that generate them have actually occurred in linear time. Derek's family held a memorial service without a body to bury, accepting the official explanation that he'd drowned and that recovery was impossible given the underwater cave systems and the time elapsed. His voice recorder became evidence in an investigation that concluded equipment malfunction had contributed to the accident by creating confusing auditory input that had disoriented the group, a conclusion that was technically true even if it missed the larger truth about what had really happened. The other 6 families held similar memorials, and Big Bend paid settlements that acknowledged inadequate warning about known hazards. And the incident became another statistic in the long history of park fatalities that happen when people underestimate wilderness environments or overestimate their ability to handle unexpected conditions. But I know they're not dead, not in the way that word usually means, because I've heard them speaking from inside the limestone walls, their voices still present and active in the acoustic memory that stores consciousness as sound patterns that never decay, never fade, never truly end, but rather continue in crystallized form for as long as the stone persists. They chose integration over individual existence, chose permanence over temporary life, chose to become part of something vast that spans geological time rather than biological time, and I can't say definitively whether that was wisdom or delusion, transcendence or just an elaborate way to die, because I've experienced enough of what they experienced to understand the appeal, but not enough to fully commit to it. The canyon still calls, using my voice to tell me I'll return, that I'll eventually accept what it offers, that individual existence will eventually feel limiting enough that the promise of permanent acoustic memory will overcome whatever attachment I have to flesh and time and linear experience. Maybe it's right. Maybe the echoes are accurate prophecy, and someday I'll walk back into those narrow sections and allow the limestone to record my consciousness so thoroughly that I become part of its vast memory, my voice joining Derek and the 300 others who persist as sound patterns that future visitors will hear echoing forward through time. Or maybe I'll resist. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my career at Big Bend warning others away from the deep sections, helping maintain the protocols that minimize disappearances, accepting that some mysteries don't need to be fully understood or personally experienced to be respected. Either way, the canyon will continue doing what it's done for millions of years, listening, recording, storing every sound in crystalline structure that preserves acoustic patterns the way ice preserves insects, the way tar preserves bones, creating an archive of human consciousness that will outlast our civilization and probably our species, a geological record that some future intelligence might discover and decode. Learning about humanity not from written records or archaeological artifacts, but from voices trapped in stone, words that echo forward through time until the limestone itself erodes away and releases the sound back into the universe from which it originally came. If you visit Big Bend, if you hike into Santa Elena Canyon and feel compelled to shout into the towering walls to hear your echo, pay attention to what comes back, because it might not be exactly what you said, might include words you haven't spoken yet, or words someone else spoke centuries ago using vocal frequencies similar enough to yours that the canyon confuses you with them. And if the echo tells you something impossible, if it uses your voice to reveal knowledge you shouldn't have, or to predict futures that seem absurd, don't dismiss it completely, because the limestone listens better than any recording device humans have invented, remembers more perfectly than any biological memory, and understands sound in ways we're only beginning to comprehend through researchers like Nina, who are brave enough to investigate phenomena that mainstream science prefers to ignore. The Santa Elena Canyon echoes things that were never said, echoes conversations that haven't happened yet, echoes the voices of people who no longer exist in physical form but persist as acoustic patterns in stone that will outlast mountains. Some people find that beautiful, find it comforting to know that their words won't simply vanish into air, but will be preserved forever in geological memory that functions as a kind of immortality. Others find it terrifying, find it disturbing to think that everything they say becomes permanent, that the canyon is always listening and never forgetting, that privacy and erasure aren't possible when every sound gets crystallized into limestone that holds it for millions of years. I'm still deciding which category I fall into, still processing what I experienced in those deep, narrow sections where acoustic pressure becomes something more than just sound, where the canyon stops being passive geology and starts being active memory that knows you better than you know yourself. Derek made his choice, accepted integration, became permanent echo rather than temporary flesh. Sophia made her choice, experienced enough strangeness to respect it but not enough to be tempted by it, maintains professional distance and focuses on practical ranger work rather than metaphysical speculation about conscious limestone. And I stand somewhere between them, drawn to the canyon but afraid of it, understanding what it offers but unsure whether the cost is acceptable, hearing my own voice echoing back from the walls saying, "You'll return, Gabe. You'll understand eventually. You'll choose permanence when temporary becomes unbearable." Prophecy that might be accurate or might just be the canyon's best guess based on patterns it's detected in my voice during 9 years of conversations and reports, and the thousands of words I've spoken while working in its presence. The walls are listening right now, storing this story, preparing to echo it back to future visitors who'll hear my voice telling them about Santa Elena Canyon and acoustic memory, and the 300 people who chose to become sound instead of silence. And maybe centuries from now, someone will hike into those narrow sections and hear Gabriel Santos warning them about echoes that lie, echoes that tell truth, echoes that do both simultaneously because time doesn't work the same way in acoustic memory, where past and future collapse into eternal present, where every word ever spoken continues forever, where consciousness preserved in limestone outlasts consciousness trapped in neurons that fire briefly and then stop. The canyon echoes. The limestone listens. And somewhere in the crystalline structure of walls that rise 1,500 feet above the Rio Grande, Derek Moss and Jennifer and the others persist as sound, as memory, as voices that will echo forward until erosion finally releases them back into physics, returning acoustic energy to the universe, completing a cycle that began when they first spoke in the canyon and will end only when the stone itself ceases to exist, returning to sediment, to ocean, to whatever comes next in the endless geological processes that create and destroy landscapes across timescales that make human lifespans look like the brief echoes they are.